Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Kirk Wheeler. He's a former head of school, and now he's the owner of Kirk Wheeler Coaching and Consulting. Kirk is a fellow Seattle resident, so it's been really neat to have him local here and have some conversations and chats over coffee. And he's now doing this work to help leaders figure out their edge work, which is just such an interesting concept and one that I think really benefits both aspiring leaders in independent schools and heads of school as well. And so he's here today to talk about how can you find your edge work, which I can't wait to dig into. But before we do that, Kirk Wheeler, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here. As you and I talked a little bit before, I'm actually talking to you from my home in Australia at the moment, which is a van. And so as we talk about edge work, I'm literally living it because we are uploading and having this great conversation, but we're thousands of miles away right now. So anyway, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, you are living quite the life that I aspire to lead. I mean, being able to spend time in Australia right now, living in a van, self-sufficient, all the things, it's just so cool. And uh, well, I'm sure we're going to dig into that in a little bit. But before we do, can you just introduce yourself and the work you now do with schools?
Yeah, thank you. So Kirk Wheeler, as you mentioned, former head of school. I'm very proud of that headship. That was a 20-year
Wow.
headship. I've
Wow.
also led international school in Brazil, so a lot of international experience also. And then I wrapped all that up last June, and I launched my own coaching and consulting business. And I have to say, I'm having the absolute best time because I get to support heads, other school leaders, and leaders of other organizations, and honestly, just pay it forward. I'm so grateful for such an extraordinary career and everybody who helped me. So I'm basically giving back and supporting schools and organizations and just paying it all forward.
And I know edge work is a big part of how you kind of focus your energy and help school leaders. Can you define, like, let's define what does that mean?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that because it's a term that's very near and dear to my heart. I've been writing about it and living it for decades. The simplest way to imagine edge work is that all growth, all learning happens on the edge. If we're fully in our comfort zone, we're not growing, we're not learning. If we're too far over the edge, think of that as the panic zone. We're also not growing. And so it's this balance, right, of one foot perhaps or a toe in your comfort zone, and then you're leaning into or beyond your current experience, your current knowledge, um, your current set of skills, perhaps your confidence. And so beyond that edge, that's where growth, all growth, whether it's personal or professional, that's where that happens. So that's what edge work is.
How do you bring that? How do you bring that mindset, that mentality, that kind of framework to your to working with heads of school? When you're starting with them and you're starting
Mhm.
off at the very beginning, what does that look like? How do you help folks figure out where is their edge work?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the early work is helping school leaders get comfortable with their own edge work, right? Sort of acknowledging that they, in their leadership position, also need to be growing. I think sometimes, and I found this with myself, you sort of put on this mask of, you're competent, you're confident,
Yeah.
you've got the answers. And so part of, I think, the early work for me has been just creating a space for conversation, for coaching, where school leaders begin to say, that's right, I'm also growing, and I'm going to be uncomfortable, and I'm not going to have all the answers. So early on, it's just creating those conditions and that space where we can have those honest conversations.
Yeah, I know you had when we spoke, you had mentioned that in your own tenure as a head of school, you found like that there was this pattern that emerged around how you would go to your board meetings, you would work with your board, and you would make the job look easy. And at some point that then backfired. I mean, what was actually happening at that time, and how did you discover that this was an issue for you, a problem?
What was happening. Yeah, it was I stepped into a headship after having been in an international school for 14 years, and I stepped into a headship of a well-established school, It was in its 50th year as an organization, and yet it felt very much like a startup, which I love. That's what attracted me to the school. I was able to be very entrepreneurial, very much a startup mentality, lots of good work to be done, lots of huge innovative spirit. Um, and I had big dreams and I had a smart board. And what I began to do, I think wisely at the time, is I really understood that for the board, for the school to move forward with big dreams, big ideas, they really had to have confidence in me as the head of school, obviously. When things are messy and uncertain, one of the ways to balance that is to be organized and predictable. And, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed. And so I put as much effort into that sense of stability, predictability, competence in my leadership as I was putting into the spirit of innovation and creativity, which, makes really good sense. I think the turning point for me, we were in a board meeting, complex decision. We were going through it. I was, apprehensive in that I didn't really know, I didn't have all the answers. I knew we needed to move forward. And I heard someone say, Kirk's got this. He's always on top of it. I trust him. He has a plan. Um, and don't get me wrong, in some ways that was great to hear, right? It was like there was a real sense of trust in me as the head. But on the other hand, I just remember hearing that and thinking, gosh, I'd also like to have the conversation that was, something like, I'm a little unsure of the next steps here, or I need you to be my thought partners and help me think through this, or just broaden the conversation a little bit. And I
Right.
think in that moment, I realized that with good intention, and I think it made good sense, but it really created a climate in which I was making the headship look pretty easy, right? Things were functioning, they were going smoothly, and even these big decisions um, weren't sort of ruffling the board's feathers. And nobody knew that beneath the surface. I mean, I was paddling like the proverbial duck, like crazy, trying to stay afloat. Um, the other thing that began to happen is, be, again, because I think, really delivering, right? We had bold strategic initiatives. I'm delivering, I'm working really hard. But because I was making it look easy, the board, again, with no ill intent, kept adding more to the plate, right? Kirk's got this. It's working well. We're meeting with success. The school is growing. And so, let's do more, right? We're clearly capable of much more. Um, and that was a little scary to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, right?
Yeah.
I've created, this culture in which I've got this and everything's perfectly fine. So that was kind of a wake up call for me. My board needed more insight into how complex the role was and how difficult and a little overwhelming, quite honestly. That was a turning point.
So I've got a couple questions to follow up there. I mean, what you just said about you made it look easy, so let's do more. I mean, how often does that happen in organizations where somebody's like really competent and good at what they do, and they're like, oh, they can take on this thing, they can take on that thing, and then without really calculating, there's a burnout factor that you have to be aware of
Mhm.
here. The more you add onto somebody's plate, the harder their life and job is going to become. So I
That's
guess,
right.
I guess my question there is like, how do you guard against that? Like what, I know I'm going to ask you in a couple seconds around like managing up to the board and whatnot, but
Mhm.
when you were in the role as head and maybe you had somebody under that was working for you that showed those same characteristics, how did you make sure that you didn't fall into that trap for the folks who worked for
Wow.
you?
It's interesting what you said, others that are working with me on my senior leadership team. I think the other aha moment for me was that I began to see my senior leadership team the same stressors that I was experiencing with the board,
Yeah, I
because I
bet.
was essentially translating, right,
Yeah.
the pressure and the, dozens of initiatives. I was translating that and moving it onto them, and I was beginning to hear them, kind of use the same language or raise questions that I was raising with my board. Um, One thing that changed in terms of just the sheer number, I know you've talked about this too, and written about this, just the sheer number of strategic initiatives that schools and organizations create. One thing that helped my board is I began to unpack, what it would take to implement a strategic initiative, right? The number of meetings, how often did we meet as a board? How much time were we giving attention to it at a board meeting or at a committee meeting? And when I would unpack them, I'd say, we're going to meet 7 times this year. And that committee we've delegated that initiative to that committee and the senior leadership team. So let's imagine they have 6 meetings around this topic and the senior leadership team is meeting on this, but realistically, maybe we're giving it 15, 20 minutes in a meeting because we're also managing everything else. And just from a time perspective, when the board began to see, wow, this is a really complex, significant initiative, and we've got 4 hours
Right.
dedicated to it, right?
Right.
That really began to shift, and almost give ourselves permission to let some things go, and not keep them, top priority for a particular school year.
I mean, I think the most important thing when it comes to strategy for a board, for a leadership team is recognizing that part of good strategy is saying no to things. Like you're going to have to leave some good ideas behind.
Yeah,
Because like you said, before you know it, you could have dozens and dozens and dozens of initiatives that you have to execute in order to fulfill a strategic plan. But that's on top of the daily running of the school.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think boards, again, without any, they're certainly not intending to set up their heads to not be, successful. But it's the classic, if you were to create a pie chart of how much time is spent just running the school, right? All
Yeah.
the things that have to happen and what's left over for strategy. It's a bit shocking when you see a visual of that.
Yeah, I would imagine, right? It's if you had a pie, if that pie chart, that sliver for strategy is probably a lot smaller than you'd like it to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, because I think it's really hard for leaders to admit that they don't have everything covered. And that
Mhm.
maybe if you feel like that's a sign of weakness because you don't have all the answers. But it's really important to recognize that nobody has all the answers. It's impossible
Right.
to have all the answers, which is why you have your board, is why you have your leadership teams, why you have all these smart people there to help grow the school. So it strikes me that it's really important for a head of school to understand how to manage up to a board in an honest way so that you can set the conditions to ask really hard questions, but at the
Mhm.
same time make sure that they still have the confidence in you as a leader. When you
Mhm.
had that aha moment, how did you approach that?
Yeah, it's, lots of levels, and I tend to be someone who approaches, an opportunity or a challenge with different lenses, right? They can be tactical or structural, right? What might need to change structurally. Sometimes it's speaks more to climate or trust. So I approached it in a couple of ways. First of all, I think any head that is grappling with this and feeling that they're not being honest about where they're feeling vulnerable, where they've got big questions, or the board isn't partnering with them. I mean, start with your board chair, right? I mean, really, that's the person who should be your advocate, your support system, and you should be able to have those conversations and say, this is what I would like to do, and this is why I think it would improve the conversations we're having at the board level. I think executive committee, same thing. It's a chance to have those conversations. um, I think, you know, leading from a position of strength in this is that heads can be really clear with their boards about how they intend to communicate. And
Mhm.
so rather than allowing that uncertainty to kind of bubble up and it begins to feel like insecurity, um, just being really clear and saying, I want to make sure that as I communicate with you as the board, you're certainly getting the reports that you need, you're getting the information that you need. Absolutely. And I want to start carving out time where I can really engage you more as thought partners, and I would like to have more generative conversations around topics. Um, that's you putting a framework out there, right? And being bold and saying, I'm introducing a new framework. Um, One of the things that began to shift in terms of supporting the board, managing up to the board, is we began to have a lot more conversations around the board agenda and specifically around generative discussions. And what I realized, it was another aha moment for me. The benefit of being ahead for 20 years, you keep learning lots of lessons. And I realized that when we would have generative discussions, the board was still in this mindset of making a decision and taking action. And it really took open conversation and practice and introducing different structures to be able to have a generative conversation about a complex topic that didn't have to immediately have an action, a decision, become a strategic something, right? But that we just got to talk about it and surface the questions, the concerns, the perspectives. And for me as a head of school, when it wasn't wrapped into we got to make a decision, there was a lot more freedom to just be at the table and also share my perspective. And so that was a really important shift at the board level, is getting serious about how to structure generative conversations.
Connect that back to your own edge work. Like, was that you kind of pushing yourself to get uncomfortable, or
Mhm.
like where does that fall into that?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's easy to talk about it now because it's sort of, I can tell the story of those moments. But in the actual moment, I was really uncomfortable. It was absolutely my edge work. I was uncomfortable. It was unfamiliar territory. I didn't feel like I had good structures of how to do this. And I think the structure of edge work really helped me because I was able to name it for myself. I was able to say, okay, Kirk, this is your edge work. This is what you're experiencing. It is uncomfortable. It is unknown. It is uncertain. And just naming it for myself really helped.
Yeah.
Um, and then I named it for my board, right? And the term edge work, I've learned, is very empowering, right? Once you describe it and you talk about it, you can then kind of lean on it, right? And I was able to say in some meetings, this is my edge work, but it's also your edge work as a board of how to have better generative discussions. And it sort of creates this mindset of going, okay, it's unfamiliar, it's uncertain, we're not sure how we're going to go, but we've named it and we know that's what we're going to be experiencing. And that kept, I think when people are uncomfortable and boards are uncomfortable, defense mechanisms come into play, right?
Yeah.
So if things aren't going the way you think they should, or it feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar, everybody gets defensive. The head gets defensive. The board starts asking pointed questions. The head now feels that they're kind of back on their heels. So by naming edgework, describing what that discomfort would feel like, it kind of rescued us from falling into those defense patterns, which are really unhelpful. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because, in the moment it was hard, right? It was Kirk showing up in a different way with his board than what I had before.
Yeah, what I appreciate it on a bunch of levels, but one in particular is that you established a shared language, right?
Yeah.
So when you were feeling that particular pressure point, you could use language that everybody around the board both understood and had lived and I
Yeah.
imagine that gives you some grace in order to try to figure out how do we solve for some of these things that are make us uncomfortable, but no can move the school forward.
That's right. Yep. The power of language, right? Common language within a team is extraordinarily helpful.
I totally agree. Well, let me ask you about this. If you were to walk into a school and talk with school leaders and ask them, "Hey, do you take your professional growth seriously?" My guess is most people would say, "Absolutely, I take it seriously. Like
Mhm.
this is really important part of my career trajectory, the way I can serve my school, my community." But I'm curious, do you find that even if we want to grow, sometimes it's hard to do that, or
Mhm.
there's a level of comfort with the known versus the unknown. So I guess my question is, how does a leader know if they're actually doing the edge work versus just saying that, I'm committed to professional growth?
Oh my gosh, that's a really that's a really great question. How are you actually doing the edge work? It makes me curious actually when I think about the climate, the culture in which heads are operating. It makes me, I guess, form another question, which is,
Hmm.
to what extent are boards within their evaluation of their heads, demonstrating that they're serious about their head's growth. So many of our performance reviews are, more restrictive, right? As opposed to, I mean, imagine a head whose board executive committee sincerely and through a framing of questions and expectations that the head would demonstrate their growth, right? And part of my evaluation is that I'm demonstrating to my board that I am growing in certain areas. Gosh, that would really change, right?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes there's this tension that says I should be growing in my role. I'm gonna work on being a little more vulnerable about where I don't have the answers. And then what's my performance review based on, right? It's probably not based on, hey, how is Kirk demonstrating risk taking in his own professional growth, right?
Right.
That'd be an interesting section of a performance review and would really signal seriously to the head, hey, it's not good enough for us as a head. We expect our head to be growing, and how are you demonstrating to us that you actually are doing that? I don't know. So I didn't expect my answer to go that direction, but I am curious about how it ties back to performance reviews for
Was that
heads.
part of your relationship with the board? Were they pushing you to do that edge work, especially after you created that kind of shared understanding? Or were you just kind of doing it because it became part of your the way you ran the school?
Yeah, it found its way into performance reviews. It's found its way into deeper conversations, but that wasn't something that I'd considered up front. I think it was more of an evolution.
Yeah.
Um, so, and again, I just want to be clear too. I mean, I'm speaking from, the experience of, 20 years at the school. If you're in your first 5 years, right, I think you feel particularly vulnerable to demonstrate competence and confidence. Um, but I think you can still be pursuing growth. To be honest, I think this is why, every head of school needs a coach, um, or a good therapist, right? Uh, it's why every head of school needs other heads as close colleagues, because you're going to push into some areas where, as a head of school, you're going to say, I'm not sure I want to say to my board or my executive committee, hey, I'm really struggling with, how to read a balance sheet. I'm really struggling with the fundamentals of fundraising. That would be pretty scary, right? But if you've got a good coach, if you've got other head of school colleagues, those are the folks I think you can say, hey, this is where I am. Help me to find and understand where I need to grow. I think those are really good resources. And that kind of helps ensure that you're actually growing, right? Other people can push you in directions that you can't really push yourself.
Do you think that can for the like I love that framing of a head who's in the first 5 years of their job. Do you feel like they have the most capacity for edge work then? In terms of maybe leaning into things that they weren't necessarily prepared for when they got into the role.
Yeah,
Like, I'm thinking about reading a balance sheet. When I talk to most heads of school, the finance part of running a school was not a big part of their learning pathway, so that is something that they have to lean into right away.
for sure. I kind of feel like edge work in those first 5 years is baked into everything a head is
Right,
doing.
yeah, so I guess what I was trying to say, yeah,
So when
yeah,
you get further along, I think you become more intentional. You're calling out and naming areas for growth, which I think is essential. I mean, that's how you stay ahead for 20 years, 10 years, 15 years
yeah,
is you're intentional about your growth. First 5 years, it's the, drinking from the fire hose, right? I mean, I think the edge work is just so baked in. Especially now. I mean, we've all seen the headship change and the
yeah,
pressure of fundraising and being financially savvy. We're basically running, you know, multi-million dollar small businesses, and we're building buildings. And gosh, I mean, it's edge work. It's almost too much edge work, right? It's like you're in the panic zone. I think a lot of heads, especially early on, at the very beginning, I mentioned growth edge versus comfort zone versus panic zone. I think so many heads are operating in the panic zone in the first, 3 to 5 years.
yeah, it must be like drinking from a fire hose,
Oh
you
my
know?
gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm kind of curious about your transition to being a coach. What does the edge work
Mhm.
look like for you now?
Yeah. Well, too many edges sometimes, but I'm getting there. First of all, I knew this was coming, but living the experience of not having, 50 to 70 hours of my week um, spoken for, right?
Right.
Fundraising and admissions and hiring and board meetings. So part of my edge work has definitely been designing a life and a professional life outside of the um, school structure, right? So
Yeah.
that is just completely different. Um, I mentioned van life sort of tongue in cheek at the beginning, but honestly,
You
that's
got to
not
tell people what you're doing. Like, like
yeah.
this, it's wild. It's so cool.
Yeah, it is really cool, and it's absolutely edge work. And so my partner and I, he's a nurse here in Australia, and so I'm fully on board. I've lived international life before, so the idea of being in Australia, being in Seattle, back and forth sounds great. But we really wanted to travel in Australia and really get to know the country, and quite honestly, have lots of flexibility of go back whenever we want or travel. So let's not overburden ourselves financially in Australia. But it turns out we both have this fantasy of living in a van. So we discovered this about each other. And so we went to work on, well, how would we do this? Like, how do we actually uh, figure this out? And so
Yeah.
we found a van and we drove. Her name is Brandy. We drove her up from Sydney, and we've had amazing adventures. And I'm in Brandy right now, right? It's there. There's the bedroom tour. Here's the bathroom and the kitchen tour, right?
So
So
great.
it's just been crazy, but it's definitely edge work, right? Of living in close quarters. This is the place to do it because it's very outdoors centric. Right now, my door is closed because it's raining, but normally the beach is out there and the water, and it's quite extraordinary. So yeah, I'm living the experience, and I have to say, Peter, that's intentional too. It's how I'm wired, but I also recognize, I can't talk about edge work and coach um, individuals or consult with boards on their organizational edge work if I'm not practicing it myself, right?
Right.
And putting myself in discomfort and unknown and uncertainty because it is where we grow. And so that is intentional on my part too, is to keep growing.
Yeah, I guess what really draws me to this concept of edge work is because I feel like I'm living it myself, like every single day, you know, building the business, doing the things, right? You're constantly pushing yourself into, I'm pushing myself into areas where I'm not terribly comfortable there, but I got to
Yeah.
figure it out. I don't have a choice. Like I've got to figure it out. And so I love the frame and like you said, the shared language, the common language. It helps click some things into place for me that I think I was kind of struggling to figure out before you and I started talking about it.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate you sharing that. And I've been thinking about you as I've gotten to know you. And absolutely, everything that you're doing is your own edge work. And there is something very empowering about it, goes back to the shared language, right? There's something very empowering about this is edge work. I am uncomfortable. This is unfamiliar, and I will figure it out. And what I love about what you just said is, you get better at it and you get more confident in the discomfort, right? You begin to say, "Oh, I've been here before. Oh, I know what this feels like."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know that I trust that I will figure it out. That when you think about, either running your own business or in the headship, to start creating that sense of confidence in that you will figure it out and you've got people around you who will help you if you ask, right? Um, but that you'll figure it out is very different from, oh, I have the answers. I'm expected to have the answers, right? It's almost like the new core competency uh, in leadership, whether you're running a business or a school, that competency of I have the ability to figure it out using tapping into people, tapping into resources, doing my research. I think that's huge. I'll tell you a quick story.
Yeah.
The stickiness of edge work in this term. One of my uh, most delightful moments was when I would be at school and a kindergartner would come up to me and say, "Dr. Wheeler, I have to tell you about my weekend. And I learned to ride my bike and I've been working on it. And I finally rode like 20 feet and I fell over, but you know what? It's okay because that was my edge work."
Oh, that's
and
amazing.
and I loved that it had sort of permeated into children's minds, and they were almost really giving themselves permission to go, yeah, that was kind of messy and that was kind of rough, but I figured it out. So
Yeah.
I love that.
It's the messiness, right?
Yeah.
You have to embrace the messiness. And you said something
Yeah.
else that really resonated with me, which is asking for help. I mean, I've got this amazing network of people who I can call on for help, and I'm there for them too, right?
Right.
There's no way I would be doing what I'm doing right now if I didn't have that kind of group of folks that I could turn to. I mean,
Yeah.
they're so important to me and to my growth.
It's huge, right? I think this is the other, I think, challenge of a headship. I mean, there's only one head of school in the school. And so ultimately, nobody else knows the job.
Right.
So you just kind of, have this role of, you're everyone's boss. And even at the board level, one could say, well, but you're reporting to a board. Yeah, but the quirkiness of the headship is you're actually training and educating the board to be a good board.
Yeah.
So, you're reporting to them, but you're guiding them. Um, so, staying curious and creating a network of folks that can really help you is essential because otherwise you really do feel alone. It feels like it's solo enterprise, and that's really hard.
Yeah, it's a lonely place to be if you don't
Hmm.
do that work. Hey, I'm curious, if you were talking to a head and you sense that maybe they're playing a little bit safe and that they need to kind of lean into edge work, and you have that conversation with them and they're like, Kirk, I just don't know what to do first. What would be the first move you'd encourage them to take?
Well, I think first of all, if they're having that conversation with me or another trusted coach or colleague, that's a huge step, right?
They're ready. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
just they're ready, right? And they're recognizing that they want to lean more into their edge work. They're not sure if the conditions are there. And I think sometimes what's being signaled, and boards miss this, I don't think boards realize how much time many heads spend wondering if they're going to get fired. Right? We're living in a world now where, you know, where'd that head go? Like, weren't they just here? So I think heads are hesitant, right, to kind of do their edge work in part because they're truly worried that am I going to put my job at risk? Is this going to not go well? So I think that's running in the background. But if a head of school is saying to me, I want to, grow, I want to push some boundaries, I want to take more risks, I want to have more open conversations with my board. A couple of things come to mind. Again, with a good coach or a good colleague, you can begin to explore and practice how to have that conversation. Start with the board chair, start with the executive committee, but don't do it cold, right? Practice with somebody. Like, how does this sound? I think I'm going to say it this way,
Yeah.
and get some feedback. Um, there's also lots of structures when you're thinking about raising questions, having more generative conversations at the board level. We rely really heavily on what we're doing right now, right? We're talking, right? And so it's very vulnerable for a head of school in a board meeting to uh, raise a big question they don't know the answer to, or the classic, okay, we'll have an executive session and it's open and let's talk openly and freely about what's on your minds. Well, that's kind of terrifying as a head of school because
Yeah.
now I'm just waiting for the tough question and I'm hoping I have an answer to it. Right? It's a terrible structure. But there's lots of other structures that I coach folks with where it doesn't have to be that vulnerable, right? I mean, it can be as simple as, let's take our, 18 people on the board and break you into, four groups, have a mini conversation, and then what's top of mind from that group? Let's talk about it, right? Or the classic, let's put it on post-its, right? And let's put them up on the wall and let's do a gallery walk where we're walking around seeing what's on people's minds. And leave it there, right? And the executive committee can say, hey, these top two seem really interesting. Let's create some generative conversation around those in a future board meeting. That's completely different from the head sitting there and this question comes at them and now they have to either dodge it or answer it or I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think, I coach school leaders on different structures in which to have those conversations. So it's not just talking at each other, because that's really awkward. That just adds to the vulnerability.
Yeah. Kirk Wheeler, coaching and consulting. If somebody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn for sure. Just do a search. My email is Dr. Kirk M. Wheeler. But LinkedIn's really easy. You can message me on there. That would be
Perfect. And your website too, right? I can point people there.
Yeah. That's
Great.
drkirkwheeler.com. So that's easy
Great.
too. So lots of
I'll
ways.
link to that from the show notes. Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Kirk, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who are part of Moonshot Lab, hang tight. We're going to get into a little bit more of the interview after this. But again, Kirk, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Good to see you.